What we're doing. Good, how are you?
Okay, folks, I think we're ready to get rolling here.
I was funding your district's tax base last night. We picked up our dog. We were down in the weekend. We picked up our dog at the WAG Hotel in West Sac. Yeah. Maria, how you doing?
Welcome, everyone, to the November 4 Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting. I'm Susan Tatayan, Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, and very happy to see you all here today. Before we begin, I'll take a moment to note that the 2019 State of the Estuary report is out. Copies are available near the door where you entered. Also, the Delta Plan 5-year review highlights report is in your in the members' briefing binders, along with the July 15 meeting summary. And if any DPIIC members have any changes to that summary, please let Amanda Bowl know. I also want to note that our partners with Department of Interior are joining us via webcast. Associate Deputy Secretary Kyle Weaver is participating by webcast, as is Aubrey Betancourt. She is Senior Advisor to Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, Dr. Timothy Petty. So if they have any comments or questions, they'll be texting Amanda Bowl, and she'll share their input with us. So now let's go around the table, introduce ourselves. If you have an update you want to share, and you can share it in less than 60 seconds, please do, but don't feel that you have to. There are coordination updates in your briefing binder under tab item 5. So let's start with Jeff McLean.
Good afternoon. Is that better? Better. That's okay. My name's Jeff McLean. I'm here for Dan Castleberry, acting this week while he is on leave. Dan is the Assistant Regional Director for Fisheries and Conservation. Dan usually sits here for Paul Souza, our Regional Director. So I'm familiar with the committee because I was on one of the subgroups in the Science Initiative that's later on our agenda today. So look forward to the conversation.
Hello, my name is Louise Conrad. I am the Deputy Executive Officer for Science with the Delta Science Program. I am sitting in for Dr. John Calloway, who's the Delta Lead Scientist, and could not attend today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Tim Ramirez, a member of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board.
Chuck Bonham, Director, California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Good afternoon. Maria Ray with NOAA Fisheries, sitting in for Barry Thom.
Good afternoon, Oscar Villegas, Yolo County Supervisor, Chair of the Delta Protection Commission, and I'm here by way of my role serving on the Delta Stewardship Council.
I'm Wade Crowfoot, California Natural Resources Secretary.
There it is. Yeah, Ernest Conant, Regional Director, Bureau Reclamation.
Cindy Messer, I'm the Chief Deputy Director at the Department of Water Resources, and I'm sitting in for Director Namath today.
Joaquin Esquivel, Chair of the State Water Board.
Kristen Peer, Deputy Secretary for Water Policy at the California Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm here on behalf of Secretary Blumenfeld.
Larry Goldsband, Executive Director, San Francisco Bay Conservation Development Commission.
Campbell Ingram, Executive Officer of the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy.
I'm Alicia Kirchner with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, sitting in for Cindy Tejeda. And I'm Ellen Blake, Assistant Director for the Clean Water Programs at EPA, sitting in for Tomas Torres.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Chikaski. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm here for our Regional Director, Mark Suggie.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll move on to Agenda Item 2, aligning objectives toward a resilient water future for California. So I'll start the conversation by noting that at the inaugural DPIIC meeting way back in April 2014, the three major plans at that time affecting the Bay Delta that DPIIC was reviewing with the purpose of exploring how the actions in those plans could fit together were the federal investments for the California Bay Delta, the California Water Action Plan, and the Delta Plan. And discussions at that time covered how the actions in these plans could be funded and how science is a powerful point of confluence for the agencies around the table. And part of the science discussion centered on challenges policymakers face in balancing action and the risks of uncertainty. Dr. Goodwin spoke about how overcoming the historic use of science to support inaction, how we must all overcome that compulsion. And then U.S. EPA Regional Director Blumenfeld observed that part of the reason science is used as an excuse or impediment is the quest for certainty. How certain or how precise do we need to be before we make a decision? So fast forward to today. Before we can map how Delta management actions fit together or how precise our science ought to be before we make decisions, we need to be clear about our objectives. And today we're striving to get some clarity around the major objectives affecting the Delta Plan implementation. So our conversation during Agenda Item 2 is focused on objectives of the water resilience portfolio, the recently revised biological opinions, the voluntary agreements, and the updated Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. Implementing these major efforts will affect climate resilience in the Delta for years, if not decades, to come. And so today's conversation is aimed at identifying shared objectives that help us prioritize the fundamental management actions we'll need to take and the science efforts intended to guide those management actions. So with that, I'd like to turn to Secretary Crowfoot and hear your thoughts on water resilience portfolio objectives.
Thanks so much, Susan, and thanks again for chairing this committee. I think it's a refreshing opportunity for all state and federal agencies to be together on a regular basis, and I'm very much prioritized being part of these meetings as much as I can be. So just to bring everybody up to speed, if you're not already there, earlier this year, Governor Newsom directed several agencies to come together within our administration to develop a water resilience portfolio that would really position our water systems and our rivers to remain resilient in the face of threats in coming decades. Why? What are the sort of events that precipitate the governor really asking us to develop a very public portfolio of actions? First and foremost, obviously, are the impacts of climate change that we're already experiencing in California. You all know that those impacts will impact our water systems in unprecedented ways. By the end of the century, science suggests we'll have 65% less snowpack into the Sierra Nevada. Our winter precipitation will become in increasingly intense periods that risk new and unprecedented flooding, public safety threats. Because of rising temperatures, our cyclical drought will be more punishing. So there are big challenges that our water systems face amidst climate change. And I would say that those impacts are being felt now. At the same time, we are a state of 40 million people that will be a state of 50 million people in the next 20 years. And with all of the pressure on our natural resources that brings, We're the world's 5th largest economy, and we anticipate further growth. And so our growth, plus these impacts of climate change, put new pressures on our water systems. The governor has challenged us to think broad and think long about what actions we need to take in the next 3 years to really position Californians at our natural places to weather all of those risks and adapt to them over time. So we've been on a journey over the last several months with a lot of public engagement to really collect ideas from stakeholders across the spectrum on California water, and then come together as agencies and recommend to the governor a set of integrated actions with as much detail and concreteness as possible to hold ourselves accountable for reaching. That would constitute essentially an integrated actions that will, over the next 3 years, put us in a good position across the state to become more resilient to all of these threats. We anticipate a public draft of that water portfolio for review in coming weeks. Lot of strong interagency collaboration that hopefully my colleagues like Secretary Ross and Chair Esquivel and Susan for certain can underscore. And we really are looking forward to sharing it with you all, your agencies, for public review. Our goal is to really establish a roadmap for the Newsom administration and all of the things that we need to do. Let me say finally, the governor's acknowledged that there's no silver bullet solution to California's water challenges. It's really an all-of-the-above approach. So what I think you should expect to see in this water portfolio is a really broad range of actions that state government can take, really focused on building regional resilience, recognizing we live in a big, diverse state. And so the water challenges that our citizens and our natural areas face are very different depending on where you're at in the state. So our goal is to create essentially a set of cohesive actions that we in state government can take with our partners, local government, federal agencies, that really help different parts of California prepare for the coming challenges to our water systems based on where they live and the unique conditions that they experience. So let me stop there, and then I might just suggest to other principals who have been putting this together, whether it's Karen or Chuck or Joaquin, to provide any other thoughts you have. And Kristen, too, of course. And Susan. It takes a village. Yeah. And Campbell and...
Is this on?
Yeah.
Oh, it is. Sorry, I'm late. Story of my life. I just wanted to add from an agricultural and rural California perspective, what's really been impressive about this one is thinking long-term about how interconnected we are, and really thinking about how to support and empower regional approaches in a very integrated kind of way, and trying to get as clear as we possibly can on state role, regional empowerment, and support for that. But I'm also especially excited because I never missed a chance to stress that this is not just about our built environment, it's these nature-based solutions, which obviously 2019 was a big year. IPCC report on biodiversity in March or April that really underscored what dire condition our ecosystems are in and the losses of species, followed 2 months later by food security, agriculture, and land management, and that this is thinking about all the ways in which we can create resiliency to withstand drought, flooding, extreme temperatures. I think one of the most striking numbers that came out of the 4th climate assessment that California did, and now we'll be working on the 5th one already, is just looking at where we live here now and how it will be very similar to Phoenix when it comes to climate and temperature, that our average is 4 days a year over 104 degrees, with projections of going to 40 days a year. So we really have to be thinking big picture, long term, but then what are the tools, what's the data, what's the investment that needs to happen on regional basis to really have regional resilience to withstand these kinds of dramatic changes that are coming at us, with nature-based solutions at the center.
So one of the things that I'm very eager to see an implementation of the the water resilience portfolio is the integration that is emphasized in the portfolio approach. And if you read the executive summary of the draft, it is a draft, but it talks about hubs of collaboration. And I think that DPIIC is an example of a hub of collaboration. Now, getting to potential shared objectives, as mentioned by Wade and Karen, we're looking to really speed up integration and incentivize regional self-reliance, which is directly relevant to a policy in the Delta Plan. So if folks have any ideas, we do have a performance measure dashboard that has some indicators for water use efficiency and water supply reliability. But if folks want to offer ideas on shared objectives that all of us at this table could undertake, given these huge efforts on measuring regional self-sufficiency and how that helps not only water supply reliability, but ecosystem function, I would be happy to hear those objectives. And I have in mind, I hope sooner rather than later, we can get to specific, measurable, attainable, and relevant time-based objectives that help not only implementation of the Delta Plan and the water resilience portfolio, but also the voluntary agreements, the revised biological opinions. I think it's time for the leaders at this table and for others to think about the integration that is needed. What are the fundamental management actions and the SMART objectives that we can all lay out together in order to leverage each other's authorities and get that ecosystem health and water supply reliability sooner rather than later in the face of a changing climate? So with that, I'd like to hear from our Regional Director, Ernest Conant, your thoughts on objectives of the biological opinions, given these other plans and initiatives in the Delta.
So, Susan, I think you've teed up the issues very well. You know, our revised biological opinions, which of course are not final yet, are just one part of the puzzle. There are many other activities ongoing, and these certainly need to be integrated. Haven't seen anything specifically yet, but in concept are very supportive of the state's portfolio effort. And, you know, there are significant changes potentially coming, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley with the implementation of SGMA. And that all ties back to water supply. And so that's something I'm sure will be highlighted in the portfolio, but again, ties back to the ability of the two projects and local projects to deliver water to farmers and communities. So those are some things I think we need to keep an eye on, and they're going to be in the forefront coming up very soon as these plans get filed with DWR in a couple months, and then as the local communities try to implement them.
Thank you, Ernest. I'm realizing I jumped the gun. I launched right into our discussion without giving Amanda Bowl an opportunity to give us more context. So I'd like to step back just a bit and give Amanda that opportunity.
Thanks, Susan. I think what I'll just do, since I think we're off to a fantastic start, and Susan, I think, has talked about the different plans that we're going to be, you're all going to be discussing today. We have a series of questions to kind of continue the conversation and to help the conversation out. I will just point out this little two-pager that we created, a little cheat sheet of the four processes: the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, the voluntary agreements, the portfolio, and the revised biological opinions. So to the degree that this is helpful for anyone who is not as familiar with one or the other. This gives just a little synopsis of purpose, scope, status, and who the lead agency is. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And if there are specific questions, the folks that know these plans are all at the table. So you've got a great group of people to discuss these issues and these processes with. Thanks.
Okay, so we have a few folks here at the table who have been participating in the voluntary agreements. And on the two-pager that Amanda referred to, for those who haven't been actively participating in the voluntary agreements, the purpose of the voluntary agreement process is to establish water quality conditions that support the viability of native fishes in the Bay Delta watershed and achieve related objectives in the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan as amended. So I think you're beginning to see that there's a fair amount of overlap, not necessarily in management actions, but in geographical location and possible effects on water quality and ecosystem health and water supply reliability, given the biological opinions in the water resilience portfolio. So, Joaquin, do you want to talk about the voluntary agreement process and where we are?
Sure, and I think maybe more appropriately, I'll step back and talk about the Water Quality Control Plan update and give some blush on the voluntary agreements, and then step back even further for a moment and just comment on the water resilience portfolio. I think what we're incredibly fortunate for in this administration is a number of efforts that have sort of come to be in a sort of generational sort of timescale. For us at the State Water Board, we recently had SB 200 passed, which is a Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Act, which for the first time really provides us a significant resource to help the million Californians that don't have access to safe and affordable drinking water, which is really about sort of a systems discussion about small failing systems and how we're best going to be able to provide for the access to clean and safe drinking water into the future, which we know climate change will further complicate because it stresses groundwater supplies, which concentrate contaminants, which mean further costs for communities and Californians in trying to provide something so basic, societally. So we're fortunate for that. The board also recently adopted wetlands policy that was a decade in development and discussion. CV salts, which is a plan to better manage nitrate and salinity in the San Joaquin Valley, was also recently passed. And so I think that so much of the water resilience portfolio is an acknowledgement for this administration that we have a lot. Sigma was mentioned by Ernest as well, which is hard to not necessarily bring up whenever we talk about the future of water management in the state of California. So the water resilience portfolio really is us trying to sort of sharpen our pencils and do our best homework and show and demonstrate that first and foremost, we've been listening these last months, listening to communities who are on the forefront of these struggles. Secretary Crowfoot mentioned the challenges that we're going to continue to face in the context of climate change. And so I think for us, it's an acknowledgement that so many of these challenges are local, so much of the spending on these challenges are local. But what forums like this, DPIIC and the Delta Plan largely, and its acknowledgement of the complexity of the sort of the local, state, and federal governments that find themselves also challenged in trying to figure out how best to address these, particularly in the context of water management. And I think that we're fortunate for I guess those discussions and these processes to better connect, as Secretary Ross said, our various authorities. And I think it really comes down to the fact that most people don't really care, and nor should they necessarily, the difference between local, state, or federal government. That government by and large is simply us expressing our authorities on ourselves to do better. And so, again, the water resilience portfolio is our attempt to synthesize, and it was appropriate that Susan, I believe it was, mentioned the Water Action Plan by accident, because it really is a synthesis of so much of the discussion and work that's gone on through the drought and now into this moment that we find ourselves. When it comes to the update of the Water Quality Control Plan, the last time the State Water Board updated the plan in any significant way was in '95. I was in the 8th grade at that time, and I think that we can all candidly say that it hasn't worked insofar as, by and large, the agreement that the projects would be responsible for meeting Delta water quality objectives. I think very cogently, the last administration then said, really the board must update the water quality control plan, that we look at the state of the species, the ESA is a poor tool to continue to try to address what is really a watershed dilemma and problem. And so the board's work to update the water quality control plan was and is that best effort to update what is a need, I think, on the generational side for a different approach, for an updated approach, a more candid approach that does take the entire watershed into account. I think dialing back to the water resilience portfolio, part of the theme of the challenges that we face are these generational, challenges that we're inheritors of this great wealth, these great systems, these projects, this system that allows 40 million people to live in the state of California. But those were all systems that were made with generational investments that happened several decades ago, including our drinking water systems and our wastewater systems, and let alone the water supply systems. And so this moment is really trying to capture how best then to make that shift in our generational sort of opportunities and thinking. It requires regulatory agencies to think differently about their work. I think it also requires project proponents to think differently about it. And I think all of us, again, writ large, have an opportunity in the voluntary agreements to say, well, what is that other opportunity? What are the assets we can all bring to bear? How is it that we connect this watershed for once amongst these disparate entities that are governing, this 40% of our state that, flows through the delta that is the heart of so much of what we do, as we all know, amongst us here as fellow governmental agencies. But I think when it comes to what's expected of us and what we can do, the voluntary agreements provide that opportunity, provide that honest assessment. I think as the secretaries can speak to as well, Secretary Crowford particularly, who's really in many meetings, many discussions. It is about trying to create some certainty. It's about acknowledging all these different opportunities that we have insofar as, again, the sort of agency efforts that are going on, these decadal efforts sometimes, and say, how do we bring them all together in closure in a way that gives us a better system in the end? So 8th graders that are in school right now, maybe in a couple of decades, we'll say, that's great that those people made those decisions at that time, because it's now allowing us to make a whole nother set of different decisions that I'm sure we can't even contemplate here at this table. So I think that for me, it's really about pursuing an honest update of the water quality control plan, continuing to create the space for the voluntary agreements, which can bring a more durable, more immediate, and substantive shift. But I think that it's incumbent upon us all to just remain honest about, the really generational discussions we've been having, and bringing some closure and some agreement amongst ourselves so that we can, again, move on to, the challenges we'll continue to face in the Delta, let alone the rest of the state. So.
Yeah, I would just point out that, the state has a clear legal obligation to update the plan, period. And it has to protect beneficial uses, which, frankly mean improving environmental conditions in the two river systems, the Sacramento and San Joaquin, and the Bay Delta. And so the water board, there's two clear pathways. One is utilizing the water board's regulatory authority and meeting the law through regulation. Another pathway to implementation is where we bring together all the water agencies and conservation groups and find a voluntary agreement that's adequate to protect those beneficial uses, which means improving conditions. It's not easy because it's terribly complicated when you think about this amount of water users in this complicated two river systems and the Delta, but we're trying to get it done. And our goal is to identify an adequate set of assets, that is flow, habitat, adaptive management framework, that can actually implement the requirements of the water board. And where we're at in the process right now is we've spent almost a year around the table building from an outline of a proposed voluntary agreement to really understand how it could work to meet the Water Board's legal obligation. We're really to the point now where as one state team, that is Resources Agency, EPA, Fish and Wildlife, Water Board, Water Resources, we're coming to an understanding of the adequacy of what's been currently proposed. And if we don't come to a conclusion that it's adequate in its current form, we'll be asking water agencies to identify additional assets to close those gaps. Obviously, this process is made more complicated as a result of the federal biological opinion. That is a new set of pumping rules that will impact conditions in the Delta. Likewise, the state is pursuing a parallel Fish and Wildlife permit to permit the state infrastructure under our State Endangered Species Act. And so within the voluntary agreement, we're committed to understanding the impact of those changed operations on the pumps with how they impact the overall environmental conditions in the Delta. It's pretty clear to us that adequate voluntary agreement has to improve conditions in the Delta. And a lot of people can disagree at exactly what that looks like, the mix of flow and habitat and the timing of flow over water year type and season. But the fact is we have sleeves rolled up, really working to identify a voluntary agreement that can deliver those improved conditions, even as these other processes under the Endangered Species Act, both federally and statewide, are put in place. And that's really our charge. The governor is watching this very closely. We're giving him updates on probably a bi-weekly basis to really help him understand where we're at on the voluntary agreements. We remain really focused, spending a lot of our own personal time on this because the ability to change the paradigm that the VAs represent, what would be a 15-year agreement to adaptively manage flow and habitat that we can actually shape around the changing conditions in these river systems in the Delta, season over season, year over year, based on monitoring and science. It's something we haven't done. And frankly, a lot of us are really attracted to the notion of being able to get new water in the river systems very soon, certainly longer than water rights proceedings and associated litigation. At the same time, we need an agreement to be adequate, or it won't withstand scientific peer review, which is required, a CEQA process, and ultimately review and consideration by the Water Board. So that is really where we're at. Our focus is in the coming few months is really to come to resolution on the adequacy of the current proposal, and if there need to be amendments made, working with the water users that have the assets to bring forward an adequate proposal. If we agree as a state team that there is a proposal that we should bring forward, it will next undertake scientific peer review, go through a CEQA process, and then be in front of the Water Board for consideration as, in essence, a plan of implementation for that water quality control plan.
As you can see, the interconnections among these huge initiatives are pretty complex, and getting to objectives that leverage the water resilience portfolio and the VAs and still are in line with the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan and the biological opinions, I think will be an exciting challenge for the next 24 months. But these efforts will affect the Delta watershed, I think, for decades. And as Wade said, the voluntary agreements are 15-year agreements. And the point is to get beyond our current construct of species-by-species management, which we really need to move beyond species-by-species management. I understand that take permits are very important, and it is a major goal of not only the Delta Plan, but Department of Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and NMFS to get sets of species back to viable populations. One of the aspects I notice in the draft biological opinions is real-time monitoring, which should help adaptive management. And so I'm hoping either Maria or Ernest, if you could speak to how that would work. That is so different than years past. And I'm very curious, with that real-time monitoring, depending on how it works, it really could help the voluntary agreements and help us measure flow and non-flow assets, et cetera.
Sure, I can try to take a stab at that, Susan. And I have just been listening to this conversation and thinking more broadly about where these efforts overlap. And I see the real-time monitoring as one piece where there is quite a bit of overlap. There's some others as well. I think really the state and federal projects in the Delta have been moving towards a system of real-time monitoring influencing the water operations for years. And I think that these new sets of biological opinions just codify that and set a path to implement that moving forward. So basically the idea is really just trying to balance and optimize the system so that you're taking water actions that benefit fish when fish are present and optimizing water supply actions when fish are not present. And there are various methods that we have in place going back years through the Interagency Ecological Program to invest in monitoring. Some of the newer advances on salmon are investing in acoustic telemetry and really having a much more established in place acoustic telemetry system throughout the rivers and the Delta, so you can track tagged juvenile salmon coming into the system. We also have new investments in genetics and potentially doing rapid genetics to verify whether or not you have listed fish in the system or whether, potentially fish that are the size of listed fish are not listed fish. So we have some of these long-standing issues that I think if we invest in real-time monitoring, we can just get smarter and bring that information into our operations. So that's one area. I think we also, just listening to this, I think we overlap a lot on objectives and trying to establish biological objectives that are meaningful and reasonable. The biological opinions have some new objectives in the Delta and for cold water management, and I also see a significant investment, obviously, in the voluntary agreements and objectives. So I think trying to learn from each other on that and share information is important. And then lastly, I think there's a lot of investment in tributary management, and I think Secretary Ross, you used the term of self-reliance or local self-reliance. So I think the idea you can't solve the scale and scope of this effort is so large, so really relying on experts in the tributaries, be they biologists or water managers, to come together and build on those pieces is something that is very much in the biological opinions with a lot of different teams on the tributaries within the state and federal water system. But I think, in the voluntary agreements, that would certainly expand that throughout the whole Central Valley. So those are just some areas of, I think, some efficiencies that we could learn from each other and build on.
Thanks, Maria.
So Chuck, did you want to offer any observations about shared objectives or other observations?
I would maybe point out two things. The first is a little bit of a joke, but there's seriousness beneath it. I'm for shared objectives. I mean, who's for unshared objectives, right? And that is the elusive goal we've all been striving towards. I think we're closer to it today than we have been before. And I think this is the collection of people and respective staffs in close communication with the really affected communities can do this, because at the end of the day, the science matters, the law matters, the policy matters, but in my experience, these things are as much people issues, and the dynamic between our important communities of people. So that's my thought on shared objectives. I would say one thing on real-time monitoring. I mean, information is good. Reliable information is even better. And obtaining reliable information has a direct connection to money. these are the harder topics for our various entities to fund. But if you're going to build a structure on real-time monitoring, you've got to put your money where your mouth is. And I think that's an element that parties shouldn't forget as we're kind of evolving the next approach to our shared management in the Delta.
Thank you, Chuck. So I'm pondering how this body, DPIIC, can help map out shared objectives among these efforts. Or even if the members at the table agree that that's something that DPIIC wants to do, do we want to strive for actually documenting shared objectives among these initiatives? Or do we want to assume that each initiative will go forth and we'll collaborate now and then? Wade, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're aiming toward in all of these processes is more adaptive, broad ecosystem management, getting away from static species by species management, right? So to oversimplify, we have a traditional paradigm where we manage for single species with regulations that change on a decadal basis. And what we're trying to do is really address the changing conditions and the growing challenges more nimbly and more holistically. So, remains to be seen whether the voluntary agreements can actually be a plan of implementation. It remains to be seen how the federal biological objectives get implemented in the parallel state process. But if there is some new components of adaptive management and more holistic management, this implementation committee may be very helpful toward that. Because what we do want to do is utilize the science that we all perform and our various roles to actually coordinate better. So I'm not sure, these processes are pretty far down the road, so I'm not sure it would be a good use of this group's time to develop sort of broad objectives to steer those, but I think potentially on the implementation of them, an interagency group of federal and state agencies that discuss things in public could be quite helpful toward, transparent adaptive management.
So I pose the question to each member at the table. Would it be useful to try and map out the objectives as they are of each of these efforts, or at least the major fundamental objectives that we would want our science teams to inform? And I'm not saying we would do that right now, but would it be useful to devote resources from each of our agencies to actually enumerate and document what the objectives are in these processes as they stand today? And not down to the minute detail, but not so high level that we can, each objective is moving toward real-time monitoring and adaptive management, but the next level below that in a shared objective, or not necessarily shared, we could actually, I think it would be informative to document the objectives of each of these efforts and search for the similarities, and that could at least inform the fundamental science that we want to invest in to guide the objectives that are similar or at least aligned. Would that be something that the agencies would be willing to devote a staff member to work with the council and at least get it in writing on paper?
I mean, my reaction, just to be candid, is I'm not sure that these discussions are happening in real time. The federal biological opinions were released a couple of weeks ago. The state parallel process will take a series of steps and actions, in coming days and weeks. The voluntary agreements are, deep into discussion around identifying that. I love the sort of the creative thinking, though I'm not sure that really spending time identifying where the objectives line up within these processes will be necessarily informative towards those processes just because they're happening in real time. I think it's potentially exciting to think about how can we integrate our scientific efforts, our monitoring, et cetera, to really help implement a more integrated system. Because let's just say, the voluntary agreements, can get done. For example, they will have a governance structure and an adaptive management structure within those agreements, but those will also benefit from all of the entities around the table. So I just think, preparing ourselves for, more adaptive, integrated, collaborative science monitoring and management would be helpful.
Ernest.
I would concur with Wade as he points out some of these things are pretty far along, and additionally there are different standards by which these different processes are proceeding. But I think it's very important that with respect to implementation that we try to coordinate to the maximum extent possible. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these actions, and we need to get the most bang for the buck. In addition to making sure that we do the work correctly and with the best level of scientific integrity. So I think it would be good to maybe at the next meeting kind of focus on how these efforts could be coordinated. They're going to be a little further along by then. We'll know exactly where the state implementation of the new BIOPS is at. And then hopefully we'll know a lot more about where the VSAs are going, Wade, right? So I think that would be a good thing to focus on is coordinating implementation.
Are there any other thoughts around the table? Okay. Oh, Tim, please.
Thank you, sir. Just one quick observation, maybe consistent with the path forward. I want to put up one more flag in the same footprint. When the flood board was remade through state legislation in 2007 and 8, and the obligation to adopt a plan for the Central Valley every 5 years came up, we're starting to scope that with DWR now for the next iteration, which will be 2022. So when we did the 2012 and then 17 plans, a lot of these same words were used, SMART objectives, regional plans. We had 6 regional plans in the valley that were folded into valley-wide plans that became the plan. We had really great coordination with the resource agencies and the agricultural community and the nonprofits from the environmental side also last time, and they put together our conservation strategy, which was adopted as part of the plan. A lot of detail, and it's the same footprint. It goes right into the Delta. There's a lot of action on the Sacramento side. A lot of good things are happening, particularly in the Ola bypass, which I think a lot of folks know about. The place really to catch up, no big surprise, is the San Joaquin. And for all the things people just stated previously, drinking water quality for small communities, protection from floods, floodplain for fish, resilience, just a lot of holes, literally, on that side of the flood system. And I think it's a good chance to integrate all of that now with the portfolio, put those pieces together. I also want to echo what Chuck said. There's a lot of monitoring that was scoped out in those documents, and some of it's happened, but probably not enough of it. It's really easy to say what needs to be done. It's harder to find the money and the resources to get it done. And without that information, we're left a little bit with the blind spot to some extent. What we're not blind about is the hydrology and the future hydrology. And it's just increasingly hard to look at when you think of the size of the river corridors in the San Joaquin Valley. There just isn't enough space. And we need more to protect people and to restore floodplains. There's a good chance there, I think, to provide an example about how these things could be folded together and look at different objectives and think about how it's going to be implemented, how the data is going to be collected. It's a lot of the same agencies, and we don't have enough people to go around and support different plans. It needs to be more integrated than it has been.
If I may, Susan?
Yes.
I think that's, it is a common theme that we continue to hear, whether in the resilience portfolio or the work that we're doing, is how do we provide better common pool resources that we're all drawing our decisions from. So common decision support tools and data sets and resources that allow us to, disparate though we may be, even on the state agency side, down to the local level, make better informed decisions off of the same sort of data and information. Whether that's aerial geomagnetic mapping of, groundwater basins in the San Joaquin that I know DWR and others are conducting, or, increased stream gauges and better spatial resolution and understanding of where water is going when. I'll also say that some of those common pool resources are just our basic fundamental agencies, like a water rights system that's functioning that allows you to be able to move water, but also be able to better account for the resource and share it amongst us all. So I think these are all opportunities for, I think, what we're identifying as real cogent investments that we can make from the state side and say, let this be the premise for our continued decision making, because it is difficult to sometimes capture everything we need to do at our level. So I think being able to focus really on the system side and say, how do we provide that base, whether it's flood, information's for floods or droughts, it's the same management decisions we're trying to make in this and reactivating floodplains is exactly that. I know that Secretary Ross is a big proponent around natural infrastructure, going back to those sort of mixed inherited legacies. One of them is there were certain things that this natural landscape did for, millions of years, millennia even, that, for humanity's sort of time on it, and we kind of changed them because we thought we needed to improve them, and we did for certain things, but we lost certain other aspects. And what our floodplains used to do for our watersheds is one of those. But it speaks to the headwater management that needs to be done all the way through the system, and it's always based off of data and information, and just having greater clarity around that, I think. So.
Great, thank you, Joaquin. Campbell.
So I would just mention that restoration runs through all of this as well, and that's certainly an area where we can continue to coordinate among the DPIIC entities to help facilitate restoration moving forward. At the last DPIIC meeting, we committed to getting an informal group of all the agencies doing restoration together and start to talk about some of the fundamental constraints. At the least, it was therapeutic for all of us. I'm not sure we made great progress, but I think that's something where we can continue to look at permitting structures and long-term O&M costs and how that integrates with all these other processes as well.
Here it goes again. Maybe this will help close the topic a little bit, but just an observation that, we talked about 4 really broad tools, or big, high-effort tools that have overlapping objectives or the same objectives. And it would be prudent, I think, for this group to talk about the real-time implementation, as we were saying, of those tools in the event we need to add more tools to see how things are going, or we need to make some pretty big adjustments to things. I know that a lot of them are ongoing, but just an observation.
Great, thank you, Jeff.
Just since we're on observations, just another observation. As a local representative, I will continue to sort of remind this group, certainly, and I know it's always present in the conversation in terms of when the rubber meets the road and the actual implementation comes to be, the coordination and the communication with the local agencies is essential, right? That's at the end of the day. It's only going to work if you can implement it, and it's typically going to be on a local level, where I think it's essential that the local municipalities and the agencies are brought along at a rate that is digestible for local municipalities with these big, overwhelming projects, right? And so I will continue to sort of remind the group, and I know it's there, and I've heard it. I've heard about the regional self-sufficiency. I've heard about the importance of local input, but I will. It's an observation, as I said. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, at this point, I think we at the council will do our best to document this conversation. What I'm hearing is that during implementation, we will, as a group here at DPIIC, take a good hard look at our actions as we move forward in implementation of these major processes, and try to find those areas that have leverage points as we move forward. So thank you very much for the conversation. it is a little mind-bending to think about the Central Valley Flood Plan and the Water Quality Control Plan and the biological opinions in the water resilience portfolio and conservation plans. And so we'll do our best to coordinate and integrate our actions here at DPIIC. With that, I think we are ready to move on to agenda item 3. So as you'll see on your agendas, actions to achieve ongoing, consistent, and reliable science funding. During our conversation just now, we heard a lot about the importance of monitoring, real-time monitoring, decision support tools, and the importance of funding and getting the biggest bang for our buck, not scattering our resources, being efficient. And I think that this panel before you will show that a lot of work and thinking has gone into each of those topics. A copy of their presentation is on the table near the door. Randy Fiorini, the Vice Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, was the notorious leader of this effort, and I'll let Randy take it from there.
Chair Tatayan and distinguished members of DPIIC, it's an honor to be on this side of the table and to provide for you an update on a very important process that has been underway for nearly 2 years. I regret that Dr. John Callaway, our lead scientist, is unable to be here today because he has been intimately involved in this from the beginning, and he could explain things in much clearer and terms than can I, but we proceed. I want to acknowledge a few people that have been involved before I launch into the presentation. Amanda Boll, our Special Assistant for Planning and Science and your DPIIC coordinator, has been a rock star. She has managed this step by step, and this has been a very quick-paced process that we have been involved in, and Amanda has managed it from the staff level with excellence. We divided our work group into 4 groups. We had assigned 4 subgroup chairs and 4 writers. The writers from the Stewardship Council science staff included Edmund Yu, Rachel Klopfstein, Kate Melanson, and Yumiko Hinneberry. Some of those folks you have met before. And a special thanks to Mike Chakowski, who is at your table representing USGS. Mike was particularly helpful as we reached the point where we needed to determine what are we going to prioritize. And so Mike, thanks for that. Thanks for all the others. I will get to those at the table with me in a few minutes. Let me see if, why science funding? Very good. That lines up with the paper I have in front of me. So as you can see from this chart, hopefully you have paper in front of you because this chart isn't that clear to read from here. But you will see that in terms of total funding for key ecological areas around the country, the Delta, our Delta, does not measure up to some of these other areas. The science-based expenditures in the Delta over the past 10 years have totaled nearly $1 billion. But overall expenditures in the Delta are notably less than the other similar large-scale ecological efforts. Science in the Delta is compliance-driven. Many of you were part of discussions earlier about the need for more monitoring. And we do a lot of monitoring. About 80% of the science budget currently directed in the Delta is in support of compliance science. A lot of that is monitoring. Majority of the funding for science comes from the Department of Water Resources and Reclamation. but statutory authorities limit expenditures to core monitoring, status and trends monitoring, and some targeted research. We need ongoing, consistent, reliable funding. Ecosystems are changing in the face of climate change. We must focus on not only the current, but emerging issues. We need to start responding to science needs and management questions rather than react to emergencies. Unfortunately, our current way of funding science does not allow us to be very responsive. To be a bit more blunt, we're doing a great job of monitoring the delta's decline. We've got that. What we need to do a better job is understanding how to improve the delta and move from reactionary science to anticipatory science. At its essence, the initiative came about to make science better. And one way to do that is to increase consistent funding and fund more than compliance science. If we want to be able to manage future environmental threats and be resilient, we need funding consistency and adaptability, which will increase our science capacity. And as ecosystems around the world change in the face of climate change and sea level rise, so does the delta. It's not enough for science and policy communities to focus on immediate problems facing the delta, but we must instead simultaneously focus on current and emerging issues. The white paper that you were presented in, well, let me back up using this slide. In 2016, the Science Enterprise Workshop really focused on the need to improve science and communication. The year following, at the State of the Estuary Conference, there was a panel specifically designed to describe science in the Delta. Out of that discussion and that panel came the understanding that there is an appetite among many of our agencies to review how we've been doing science and look towards the future. That led to the formation of a work group that created or produced a white paper that you all endorsed last April. And one of the recommendations in that white paper was to develop an implementation plan, and that's why we were here today. We're following up on the endorsement and the request that you provided to us. The work group that developed the white paper consisted of about 40 people. We added a few more after your endorsement and divided that into 4 subgroups. Representatives on the work group represent a number of state and federal agencies, NGOs, and public water agencies. So it was a group of leaders representing many interests that coalesced around what we are here to talk to you today. There are 15 total actions in the implementation plan that you have been provided, that's in your binder, along with, which includes 3 priority actions. If you endorse today's recommendations, we anticipate that the priority actions will be completed over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. The remaining 12 actions will then build and tier off of those foundational actions. As we review the priority actions for you today, you'll notice that the priorities don't directly address funding. This was done intentionally. These priorities create a base of understanding that will allow us to understand where we are and where we need to go before we pursue consistent funding. I've heard criticism of this process. In fact, I heard, quote unquote, they shot themselves in the foot by announcing that there's somewhere around $80 million a year spent on science funding. We didn't shoot ourselves in the foot. We highlighted a reality that many people were not aware of. We still do not have a real good accounting of funding. So we need to get to that, which will be one of our recommendations. 3 of our subgroup chairs have joined me at the table. Mario Manzo with the Bureau of Reclamation is here to describe the first priority action. Michael George with State Water Resources Control Board is going to describe the second priority action, and Dr. Jay Lund with UC Davis is here to describe the third high priority action. Upon their completion of that, I'll summarize it, and we'll be happy to entertain any questions. So, Mario, with that? Yes.
Two. I like that. Okay. Forgot which one to speak into. All right. Thank you, Randy. As Randy mentioned, it's estimated that 80% of science funding goes to compliance science, leaving only 20% for targeted research and emerging issues. While providing needed information for water management and quality is a good thing, we must also fund the research and synthesis needed to understand how we can make the system better and prepare ourselves for a rapidly changing environment. But before anyone can make the case for more science funding, we need to responsibly understand where we are. We need more than an estimate. We need accurate figures. This priority action, and it's actually really two actions, is our recommendation on how to address this. In connection with implementing common protocols, our group of federal, state, and local entities came to resolution on several core tenets. Those tenets were costs should be placed within the 5 categories defined in the white paper. Those were core monitoring, status and trend, synthesis, targeted foundational research, and targeted immediate research. Another tenet was costs should be reported consistent with the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR 200, ensuring a consistent counting of the numbers that we're looking at. Costs should be reported on the state fiscal year. We should report both obligated and expended costs, and the entity that appropriated the funds should be the entity reporting the costs. To also aid in the reporting of this information, we developed an easily fillable template. Recognizing the significant time that filling out this template could require of your staff, we built it upon the box template that was used for the recent biological opinions in 2018 that both Reclamation and DWR have been using. Not only does this ensure consistency between the two processes, it allowed us to focus the template on core management needs while minimizing additional staff resources. The end goal here is to submit an annual report to DPIIC, highlighting the state of science funding in the Delta for review and discussions by the parties here. We're working to complete the first report by December 31st of this year. I'd like to appreciate the Delta Stewardship Council and the Department of Fish and Wildlife for already providing their portion of the template, and looking for your guys' support to fill out the rest of that template on the funding that your agencies are providing in the Delta. I understand this won't be an effortless task, but it's a cornerstone issue for this effort, and why I've made my folks available to assist your folks in any way that we can to get that template filled out. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Mario. So our work group's second immediate recommendation is to refine our shared vision for a more robust and coordinated Delta science enterprise. Your work group recommends that we approach that refinement and revision challenge through a broad and inclusive update of the Science Action Agenda. Anticipating approval by your body, we've already started work to launch the Science Action Agenda update to a broader audience of stakeholders in early 2020. The proposed expanded outreach will invite additional governmental agencies beyond DPIIC, as well as non-governmental organizations and stakeholder communities to participate in the update as a way to promote the shared aspiration for one Delta, one science. The work group proposes that this update focus on more directly linking Delta management objectives with the science required to inform actions. Our objective is to tighten the alignment between management questions and scientific research, and thus to make that research more actionable. The update will develop, contextualize, and prioritize near-term actions, some of which you discussed earlier, like revising regulations, improving the permitting processes, and operating water supply and environmental restoration projects. But this update will give greater emphasis to the longer lead time responses to changing conditions, like developing resilience in the face of climate change, synthesizing data from many sources across the spectrum, establishing more collaborative scientific cultures to inform closer to real-time adaptive management, and improving calibration and interconnection among models that we use to inform decisions. Through this process, we'll promote improved linkages between managers and scientists so that the science enterprise remains responsive to the challenges we face in meeting the co-equal goals established by the Delta Reform Act while protecting the Delta as it continues to evolve. Thus, the work group's priority action number 2 asks DPIIC to endorse the Science Action Agenda update process and to commit the resources, both budget and personnel, to support it. With DPIIC's leadership and your agency's participation, we expect to present the revised Science Action Agenda at your April meeting. Now let me pass the baton to Jay for our third immediate priority.
The Delta is going to experience a lot of changes in the coming decade and decades. We have very rapid changes in climate, sea level rise. We also have likely rapid changes in our regulatory environment. Certainly, if the voluntary agreements come in, it will kind of revolutionize the way a lot of the Delta is managed. We also have big changes likely from changes in infrastructure around the Delta. There are still some proposals for those, which would have big effects and make us change management of the Delta. We're likely to see continued changes in the species composition in the Delta ecosystem and therefore how we should manage it. We also have some big changes happening outside of the Delta, such as the implementation of SGMA, which are likely to remove some of the water sources from some of the Delta water users, making the Delta a little bit more focal than it already is. When we look at the changes that the Delta is going to see, our contention is, this is from the Science Board, is that we're really not ready for that. And what we've proposed in an earlier letter this year is to have basically a fairly fundamental and strategic science needs assessment across all the agencies for the Delta science community that would help prepare decision makers, policymakers, the legislature for the big changes to be expected in the Delta. The effort we're proposing, and we have partly underway, consists of 2 activities. One, an advanced briefing paper for a workshop. That's underway, and we have some drafts that'll be coming out late in December, early January, I expect. And then the real kicker is second activity, which is to have a workshop, which is currently organized for late April in 2020, which will be followed by the completion of a draft Delta Science Needs Assessment document for consideration by this body and others. The drafting of the advanced briefing paper and the organization and conduct of the workshop and the drafting of the final Science Needs Assessment are starting off with cores of people, and they'll become increasingly diverse in terms of participation and comments on those documents and on those workshops as we move along, with increasing stakeholder interests, participation, as well as different scientific experts. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So you've heard the 3 high priority actions outlined. You have in your binders the full report. Let me summarize and be real clear about what we're asking for when we ask for your endorsement. The first action, implement common accounting and reporting protocols and coordinate critical review of science funding in the Delta. What that means from your agency is that you will report your science funding annually and commit to making this a standard function. That's the first commitment, first endorsement. For priority action number 2, support and participate in an update of the Science Action Agenda, of which the first step would be to collaboratively identify and prioritize the key management questions for addressing water resilience and science investments, or what we've often referred to as the gaps in the glue. We're asking you to contribute staff to this effort, primarily via the Delta Agency Science Work Group that has met previously on other matters, which will be reconvened to support the Delta Science Program in this effort. And finally, in support of high priority number 3, conduct a workshop and develop a science needs assessment for the Delta with a rapidly changing environment. Your commitment to that means not only participating in the workshop, but also considering sponsoring that event. The workshop organizers, should you choose to endorse these, will be in touch with you soon. That completes our presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Do DPIIC members have any questions about what we're being asked to endorse, or any questions in general about the science funding initiative?
Madam Chair, I do have a question. I think one of the questions that I have under the Priority Action 1, under the current funding, is answered in part by reference to the Code of Federal Regulations, administrative requirements, cost reporting, and then it goes into a lot of legal jargon that essentially says everybody will do everything ethically. And I think that answers that question, I think. Under Priority Action number 2, I don't know if it falls under this, and as I read the narrative here in the staff report, I just, maybe it's more of a philosophical question, Randy, and maybe it's for you. So in the past, at least, as science goes, there are oftentimes repetitive and duplicative funding streams, different sources, but there are different opinions about how, what would be the best course, so to speak. And in the event that there is, hypothetically, in the event that there is more of a streamlined approach, do we still have the flexibility and the capacity to enjoy the opportunity for competing science to, say for the lack of a better description, duke it out so that we can get a vetted science opinion rather than simply relying on one particular path that has been agreed upon by a body such as this. And so I guess it's more of a philosophical one, and I'm sorry that it doesn't fit squarely in one of these, but if you can just answer how that would be addressed or how that would be managed would be helpful.
We understand the question because the group that Michael George supervised had lengthy discussions about that. So I'm going to hand off your question and comments to Michael.
Calling it supervision would be going way too far. But we did, Oscar, absolutely grapple with precisely that issue. And the objective is never to eliminate controversy or drive everybody to the same conclusion. It is much more to have everybody have a shared resource to go to. The policy issues, a lot of the management actions are going to have to rely on data, information, insight that will always be evolving and that will never give us complete certainty. We're trying to expand the range of certainty that we've got, but that always expands the additional understanding that we need. So the idea here is to share information and effort and data in a way that we can all use it and apply it. But that application is often going to involve different values, different requirements of different agencies, as Ernest said, different objectives that are set in statute or by the way our various organizations are organized. But the idea is to avoid that kind of combat science where, number one, you feel like you have to fund the science in order to protect your position. Mm-hmm. And number two, as soon as you publish it, it is devalued because of the funding source.
Right.
That's what we're trying to get away from.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Any other questions? Carl?
I don't have a question per se, I have a comment. I think that goes back to the identification of the management questions. Management questions are pretty open right now. What is it that's of interest, and how do we develop science to address those management questions? And I think that's where a lot of the crux of disagreement can be surfaced, and science can be developed that addresses that. I think the key that we've been working over under the last few years, particularly in the collaborative science and adaptive management process, is how can we develop science together that answers questions? And we don't argue about how the science was done or who did it, because it's done in a mutually agreed upon way, and then we can argue over what it means. But at least the science that was developed is reflective of a broader perspective.
Thank you, Carl. Karen.
I just want to commend you all for going through this. I think this has been a really positive contribution to focus on, are we asking the right questions and bringing everyone together. And so I'm glad that this work is continuing and that you're willing to do the work to update it, because it's becoming even more important that we take the time to do that. So let's go to work.
Cindy.
Okay. I do want to say thank you. I know this has been a ton of work, and I've managed to sit in a few calls, but I've got staff who've been really, I think, working with the various work groups on this. Just a note on the accounting piece, we at the department are in the midst of a couple of really big initiatives internally to kind of work with our planning and our billing and our accounting and the reporting aspects. So this might not be our banner year for putting information in the template. We will be delivering something on that. But I think moving forward, what we're trying to do is become more nimble in our ability to report. So definitely, I know there's been some back and forth on the template. So thank you for that. And I guess maybe I had a question in, kind of reading through the materials and thinking about the meeting today, just in terms of, we kind of have a foot in two worlds, right? And I'm thinking about that forward-looking science that was in the ISB letter and some of the materials here. And, just your thoughts on capacity to do still maybe a little bit of lessons learned, because maybe we want to tie up ends from some of the information we've been collecting, but then really how do we launch into kind of that forward-looking science that I think also probably pulls in the other initiatives we've been talking about today. So just curious for thoughts.
Jay?
That's why we want to have a workshop, so we can get a bunch of smart people together and bat those ideas and those problems around. To make that workshop a little more productive and to sort of extend those discussions over a longer period of time, we had the idea of putting together a draft briefing paper and let that be kicked around sort of as a prequel to the workshop. And then after the workshop, I'm imagining that we would have some extended drafting and review process and walking it around so that we have digested this issue in some depth before we would come up with some strategic kind of conclusions. And I think a natural part of that, an obvious part of that, hopefully, is to try to integrate whatever we propose with the kind of activities we're already doing, because the hardest thing to change is how people do things. And so we're always going to be better if we can incrementally change the things we're already doing than having a revolution or something.
Yeah. Turning the aircraft carrier, right? Yeah.
Well, and I would add to that, once the workshop is conducted and these emerging issues of importance are identified, then we can begin to selectively seek additional funding. If you refer back to the first bar graph that I showed you, and you look at the discrepancy, particularly on the federal funding side for the Delta versus the Chesapeake or the Everglades or the Great Lakes, there is hopefully capacity to fund more science. But we have to be real clear about what we are currently doing and what our needs are. And so that's why the recommendations, high priority actions 2 and 3, really get at designing what our management needs now and into the future. And then I think we're on much more solid ground to ask for significant funding from either other sources or new sources.
Joaquin.
Thank you. Yeah, not unlike, I think, some of our other good work, it really is about just better understanding from what point we're kind of working from. And, certainly at the State Water Board, we don't have a lot of research dollars, but, I personally, if it wasn't already evident by the commitment from, Michael George's time, our Delta Water Master, that, we'll participate. We'll do our best to put, what research we do have going on into a format that can be, can lend itself to this, and continue to participate in the discussions around how we best get a handle of what's needed, particularly again around actual management decisions. And to your point, Randy, certainly having a better, more cogent investment on the federal side, looking at our federal partners is important, given the magnitude of this estuary, and then other similar attention that I think both the Fed implementation side, but also the agency side maybe can acknowledge could go a long way. And being able to demonstrate on our part some thinking, some analysis, and then be able to advocate for as to of what benefit those dollars are, but really, I think could go a long way to being a more effective advocate perhaps in DC. And so, we'll put our money where our mouth is, I guess, and just demonstrate first and foremost what we're doing, and again, knowing that there's not significant dollars at the board, but certainly we are incredibly invested, and the success of this effort is something that we're looking to build toward. So thank you.
Maria.
Thanks. Thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate seeing these papers come back with the recommendations. Appreciate the priority setting and completely support the 3 priorities. Just a couple of questions. One is, I see in the materials on the Tier 2 actions, priority actions already underway, and some of those actions I think are important too. So I guess in terms of bandwidth, is there a plan to continue to track some of those actions? I wasn't sure if there was a sort of who, what, and when that went with those actions underway. And then I think my second question just goes back to the workshop again, Jay, and just trying to understand a bit of the focus of that. In my own thinking, trying to grapple with changing climate and all of the changes we have underway, which you summarized very well. It seems that it would be easy to focus a day on sort of the foundational science that we need in those gaps. A different focus completely would be, how do we take the science we already have and push those into, forecasting and decision support tools to really prepare for the management challenges. So I wasn't sure how much you could accomplish in one day with those seem like potentially 2 sets of players too. If you could just speak to that a little bit in terms of your own thinking on the focus of that workshop.
Clearly, we have an impossible task. It's always difficult when you have a very big topic. How do you have a conversation about it that doesn't exceed the infiltration capacity of the audience? Because we all have a limited amount of time that we can really focus on and think and discuss articulately. So I think we probably really only have a couple of day workshop that we can really do that. And the current plan is to have about a 2-day workshop followed by a 3rd day that's much smaller group that's drafting the document, hopefully which is partly already written in the pre-workshop briefing paper. So it's not just one day where all these things can be decided, because I completely agree with you. It's not going to happen that way. Hopefully the course of the pre-briefing paper, the workshop, and then the post-workshop draft, we have an opportunity to involve a lot of people in a lot of ways and to let these ideas digest and sort of cook over time. And then we'll get it wrong later, but hopefully in a better way than we get it wrong otherwise.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And
Can
surely
I also,
we'll help you however we can.
And I'd like to chime in on the first part of your question, which is how do we make the most use of what we've been doing? How do we get more out of that, either for planning for future or better informing current actions? And that, I think, is something that this whole work group has grappled with from the beginning. And you're quite right that we've highlighted 3 high priority actions where we felt we needed DPIIC endorsement and resources and support to accomplish. But there are a whole number, I think totaling 15 recommendations, and there is work going on many of those already. Some of them are sequential. They require information from one of the other objectives before we can get into that. But one of the big things that we all agreed as we got into this work group process is that we have gathered over years really valuable data sets that go back a long time. And that very often the frustration that we hear is that that data hasn't been sufficiently broadcast widely, synthesized, and articulated so that it can be useful. So one of the things back in the other 15 objectives is to really put more emphasis on synthesis and analysis. And that's not something that's brand new. In fact, as Mario pointed out in one of our work group sessions, there's been funding available for some of that, but we haven't gotten the requests to flesh it out and make the allocation of the resources that have been available for that to actually make it happen. So that's a big part of what this whole work group is pushing for.
And the Delta Science Program will continue to monitor the progress on the Tier 2 priorities. Our lead scientist, or Louise Conrad, as is the case today, will probably be the point of reporting to DPIIC on a regular basis about progress on those matters beyond the 3 priority items that I hope you all nod your heads in agreement that you're endorsing it today.
Jeff.
Thanks for the presentation and thanks for the process. I was able to participate and I enjoyed it. As far as the priorities, yeah, the Fish and Wildlife Service really supports those priorities. As you mentioned, Michael, we're implementing a lot of those. We're trying. It's a challenge, but we would love to continue to support your three tasks. And so.
Well, I'm hearing an eagerness to support and endorse. DPIIC is not a voting body, but I think what we can do here is, unless there's any dissent and folks do not want to support, we can thank this group and say that DPIIC endorses and wishes you to go forward with the top priority actions. So with that, thank you very much. I know that these gentlemen and the folks participating in the work groups did so in addition to their day jobs. So thank you. If you kept records of the time you spent, that might also be informative for future efforts.
Susan, just very quickly, I think we should definitely recognize Randy. When he started this process, he said how quickly we were going to get it done. There was sort of collective sighs and maybe even some eye rolling. But he and Amanda really kept us on task and I think helped us do what we didn't think could be done. So kudos to Randy and staff for that.
Well, there were about 60 people involved, and there's equal accolades that need to go to everyone. It was a healthy process, and we hit our marks.
Yes. Thank you. We look forward to the first report in December. So on to our lightning updates. This is something new for DPIIC. Lightning updates meaning that the updates last no longer than 5 minutes. And we have lightning updates on subsidence reversal, structured decision-making, integrated modeling, the social science task force, and the 2015 emergency drought barrier. These are all DPIIC actions that were discussed at prior DPIIC meetings, and I think Louise Conrad will be our moderator here. So with that, let's go forward. Louise,
Thank you, Chair Tatayan. So that as you just mentioned, the talks you're about to hear are really wide-ranging in topic. However, they all do share the commonality that they are on the leading edge of some innovative work that we will be needing, this among other things, to implement the Delta Plan, the Delta Science Plan, and to achieve a more resilient Delta. So I will, in the interest of time, jump right into Campbell Ingram, Executive Officer of the Delta Conservancy. He's going to provide us with an update on efforts to reverse subsidence in the Delta. This is a specific recommendation in the Delta Plan. This work includes quantification of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in the Delta, and then the potential for landowners to participate in the carbon market by converting land to alternative farming practices or wetlands.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I'll be over here. The table was too small for participation over there. It's really exciting to come back to DPIIC and provide an update on carbon sequestration emission reduction in the Delta. We've had a few fairly significant points of progress in recent times, and I'll certainly cover that. So I'm hitting advance, and all I see is me. Can we go back a couple slides? Oh, I did that. Got it. Okay. So just to reorient us all, I love this map. This is a CalFed map from 1995. So we're going on 20 years ago, and those areas in dark orange and light orange represent about 200,000 acres in the Delta, highly organic peat soil that's rapidly subsiding. And because that's in 1995, you can also add about 2 feet of subsidence to that in the last 20 years, actually between 2 and 3. So we lose at a rate of 0.5 to 1.5 inches per year. And then we also know that sea level rise is increasing, so we know we have a problem. And this is a fundamental threat to California's water supply, because if we lose the Western Delta to an inland sailing sea, then we won't be able to export water for all the purposes that we do out of the south of the Delta. On top of that, we now are using an average of 15 metric tons of carbon emission per acre per year in the Delta. We see as little as 3 tons per year and as much as 26 tons per year coming off an individual acre. And that is just the microbial oxidation process when we take these saturated great soils for agriculture and we drain them to grow any crop. You expose that soil column to microbial oxidation, and that's where that carbon is volatilizing into the atmosphere. So in that 200,000 acres, we're getting well over 2 million metric tons of carbon per year, and that's the equivalent of about 500,000 vehicles sitting out there. It really is an astounding place. In addition to the risk it poses to California's water supply, it's a small chimney that is just really rapidly pumping carbon into the atmosphere. By comparison, if you look at California's total plant-based agriculture, millions of arable acres, this one little dot of 200,000 acres is putting about 1/4 of the carbon emissions annually into the atmosphere. So what we're trying to do in this to stop subsidence and these emissions is to provide market-based incentives and funding to help do land conversion. In April, we were very fortunate to get through the American Carbon Registry process and get an approved protocol that allows any landowner in this subsided area of the Delta to resaturate their soil, either through rice cultivation or managed wetlands, quantify their emission reductions, and then take that to market. I'm very excited to say that we are just about, hopefully by the end of next month, we will have completed our first third-party validation of wetlands in the Delta. So DWR has 1,600 acres of managed wetlands for carbon in the Delta. To take your credits to market, you have to get a third party to come in and validate your program, verify your quantified emission reductions, and certify your credits, and then you take those to market. So we're about to do that for the first time. Really excited about that. We've been working with public and private landowners to get pilot projects up and moving, generate interest. We've been working with carbon financiers who are convinced that they can sell as much carbon as we can verify in the Delta. And I'll talk a little bit about rates here in a moment. Where we're falling down is we can meet expectations of agricultural return in the Delta nearly, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But it does cost money to do the conversion from row crop to managed wetlands and/or to rice cultivation. So that's where we're going out with a great idea, having great conversations, and then we say we'd like to do this, but we need some money to back it up. Where things get really interesting is we're working with the Air Resources Board to get the voluntary market protocol adopted into the compliance space. And that's really significant because that significantly increases the value of the carbon. Before I hit the slide, one of my other big updates was, I won't mention by name, but one of the landowners in the Delta is very interested in moving forward with a whole island approach where we would actually seek funding to do planning to look at taking portions of an island, putting it in managed wetlands, putting some in rice cultivation, and then some in upland transition habitat. We would evaluate the carbon benefits, the gas fluxes, the habitat benefits, and one of the other really exciting things is if you're doing this at scale in the Western Delta and you can periodically drain these wetlands into the Delta, a food-rich resource, it could very well provide a significant boost to what we know as a food deplete system. Could even potentially be linked to voluntary agreement efforts. It's a little early, but we're optimistic. So then shifting to this slide, just a quick, I won't go through it in detail, but very quickly, the voluntary market is on the left. You see that 15 tons per acre in the upper area. You've got some buffer. You're going to take 11 credits to market at a rate of about $7 per credit. You have some other costs, and that's going to give you about $59 net per acre. Now, that doesn't entice a farmer in the Western Delta, but those that are leasing ag land back to farmers, that actually exceeds the value that they're getting from those leases. If we move into the compliance space, that $7, that second column goes to $19, and that gets to about $183 net per acre, and that is getting to a sweet spot where that's compelling to Delta agricultural interests. And then the high compliance case, there's been a lot of speculation through the years, well-founded by very people engaged in the carbon market that anticipate a price point of about $30 per ton or credit, and that gets to $300 an acre. And that's where everyone in the deeply subsided Delta ought to say, hey, I've got alternatives that don't increase my risk every day, and I can actually make more money than I'm currently making moving forward. So it is encouraging at this point that there are discussions about potentially some funding to support these efforts moving forward. I will also say that there's a paper that's just in peer review right now by Amy Merrill, who was previously with Stillwater Sciences, and it's looking at the rates of subsidence reversal that can occur in the Delta and how at about 30 to 40 years out, you can achieve enough elevation that going forward, you're significantly dropping the risk of losing the Western Delta. The point being, you don't have to go the 100+ years to get elevations to restored all the way to tidal, but if you get halfway, the head pressure that you reduce on the Delta significantly reduces the overall pressure and therefore the risk of losing the Delta in the future. So a lot of benefits, and I like my last slide because it says questions, and there's our alternatives. So thank you very much.
Okay, I think we'll move to the next speaker, and then if there's time at the end, we can address questions. Is that okay? Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Josh Israel, Science Division Chief at the Bay Delta Office of the Bureau of Reclamation. He is going to present on a pilot effort funded by Reclamation to use a structured decision-making approach to evaluate management alternatives in the Delta. This effort was endorsed by DPIIC in spring of 2017 and facilitated by the Delta Science Program.
Okay, thanks, Louise. Maybe all right. Okay, so I'm going to give a short update on what's been going on with structured decision-making efforts here, and this is a fairly new process for DPIIC and here in the Bay Delta, but this is something that's been going on for a number of years through Reclamation's partnership with Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Geological Service on the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, where we started back in 2013, actually, together doing rapid prototyping, which is the pilot effort I'm going to be talking about today, which we recently went through over the last 2 years here in the Bay Delta. So this process started back then. Rapid prototyping is a very quick process with some objectives to sort of teach people how the process of rapid prototyping works, not necessarily to present results that should be compelling enough for decision makers to use in decision making, but really it's just to bring people up to date on how this process works, because structured decision making is something that's really useful for complex and challenging natural resource decision making. And this entire process, which goes back to 2013 and which led to development of something called the Science Integration Team, which was a team of agency and stakeholder technical experts which supported development of decision support models for Chinook salmon and sturgeon, has continued to grow. And we've, throughout this process, been working a lot with the U.S. Geological Survey. In fact, Dr. Peterson, who worked with us here in the Bay Delta, he wrote this book on decision-making and natural resource management, and it's been sort of our go-to for how to advance structured decision-making here in the Delta. Within reclamation, we've used structured decision-making to help us with project prioritization, and we continue to do that over in the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program. CAMPT has also done rapid prototyping with Delta Smelt. And in 2017, finally, DPIIC endorsed Bay Delta structured decision modeling. And we engaged in that process with something like a science integration team that was full of stakeholders and agency staff. And we really did have a broad group, technical staff from a lot of your agencies, but also stakeholders from Sacramento, San Joaquin, and Bay Delta water user groups, as well as regional and statewide NGO organizations like American Rivers, Trout Unlimited, Cal Trout, Golden Gate Salmon Association, all brought people to the table to work together on developing these decision support models through rapid prototyping effort. We did that for about 18 months. I'll speak to it in a moment. And most recently, the Delta Science Plan called for including structured decision-making as a key action. CAMP, the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team, has also initiated a second phase of structured decision-making with Delta Smelt. And now we're actually moving forward in CVPIA and using structured decision-making for 5-year near-term restoration strategy development. So the Bay Delta multi-objective structured decision-making effort really started in spring of 2017. It's slightly different than a previous effort through the Collaborative Adaptive Management Team that really focused on the Delta Smelt resiliency strategy that evaluated just 13 Delta Smelt actions. What we came to DPIIC to talk with you about back in 2017 and moved forward with was really a multi-objective structured decision-making process that we wanted to show people sort of how you go through that. And that's what we did. So just to review, structured decision-making is really a collection of practices. It's really rooted in decision theory and risk analysis, and it helps to develop rigorous, inclusive, and transparent approaches towards decision-making on fundamental objectives. And earlier, Chair Tatayan talked a little bit about considering each other's objectives. This is a step that you go through in structured decision-making and rapid prototyping. Your technical experts did that through their meetings. We met twice monthly, once for a 2-hour call and then once as a full-day in-person workshop. That was certainly something that we struggled a lot with in our group, but because structured decision-making is really a set of practices, as we move forward in these additional phases of structured decision-making, the idea would be to engage decision-makers in understanding fundamental objectives. Some of the topics that we developed structured decision models for were looking at water availability and reliability using operational models like CalSim and DSM-2, agricultural models, and in fact, we were able to develop collaborative funding. The Coalition for the Sustainable Delta put up funding to support UC Merced's Josue Medellin Azura to provide us with agricultural revenue output for evaluating as part of this rapid prototyping. And then we were able to use the Delta Smelt and Chinook salmon models, which were modified and further enhanced in this rapid prototyping effort by the USGS that had been developed through CVPIA and CAMPT rapid prototyping efforts. And finally, this spring, we came out with the progress report. One thing I think is important to notice here is when we did this, there was a lot of interest in the team about thinking about flood risks. And I heard this discussed a little bit earlier. One of the limitations was we didn't feel we had staff expertise as part of our technical team or the financial resources to evaluate that. But there certainly is a need for a lot of different fundamental objectives that all can be analyzed using these integrated modeling approaches. And I think the technical staff is really interested in doing that if that's the direction people decide to go with it. So what did we learn as we advanced structured decision making? So this model development really helped to identify the ambiguities in our conceptual models to help us formalize hypotheses with data and help to integrate those into models. Like I said, we brought numeric models, both monthly and daily time steps, in to use taking their outputs of flow, temperature, and salinity to understand what those mean in a biological model with delta smelt and Chinook salmon. This pilot project really aimed to increase process understanding. Again, it should not be used to draw conclusions about candidate management actions. But I think it really did a good job familiarizing biologists and managers with the certainty in our mechanistic understanding that can link fish populations and water supply management actions. Finally, I think there was a real desire for the future efforts to continue to confront these hypotheses with real data and further link monitoring, modeling, and management, which is something we heard about on our last panel. How do we familiarize participants with the Sdm process? So this was a bit of a rolling process for the first few months, and we often had new people joining us. We think it's going to be important to develop participant roles and responsibilities and some guidelines and new participant instructions because it is a fairly complex set of practices that are used in structured decision making. But one of the things we've done moving forward, and which now exists for both the CVPA process as well as this Bay Delta process, is develop websites that provide all of the technical team notes, all of the input and output files, and all the reports that come out. The website's there for you. What were some of the knowledge gaps and data deficiencies? So people felt that high priority studies to improve models should focus on estimating fish behavior and understanding the demographic rates in the Bay Delta and the tributaries. Finally, a data repository integrating or an integrated database was something that will be very critical for model refinements and evaluations of competing hypotheses. And finally, I wouldn't be remiss, but I wanted to make sure I included some figures and tables. Of course, none of this should be used by anybody, but these are the kinds of things that we get out of this, and we got out of this process after 18 months of discussions. And so one of these is on the left-hand side, a sensitivity analysis that helps identify the model inputs and how they affect the outcome. And so we looked at all of the inputs and varied those inputs by a standard amount, 50% less and 50% more, to evaluate the effect that this had on adult escapees, which is there on the x-axis. And you can see that some things have a large effect, some things not so much. This helps us understand both the certainty we may have in our mechanistic understanding, but also potentially the uncertainty we have in the model and the way that we built the relationship in the model. On the right-hand side is a consequence table. This consequence table shows the changes in objectives under the different management scenarios. So we looked at 17 different management objectives that we could easily model with CalSim and DSM-2. And you can see for the the 3 runs of Chinook salmon, Delta smelt, north of Delta and south of Delta deliveries, crop revenue, irrigated crop area, and average water use, how those kinds of management scenarios affected those outcomes. And this is, after you have a good model that you feel people feel comfortable with, these are the kinds of things you can start to use to help set priorities and evaluate trade-offs. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Josh. Our third speaker is Ben Geske, Senior Engineer at the Delta Science Program. Ben is going to be telling us about the Integrated Modeling Steering Committee, a group that he leads and facilitates. And this group comes in part out of a recommendation from the 2016 Science Enterprise Workshop to increase use of integrated modeling to support forecasting abilities for decision making, which is something we've already talked about today, and the need for, could be a tool for forward-looking science. This effort was also endorsed by DPIIC in spring of 2017. Thanks, Ben.
All right. Good afternoon, and thank you, Luis, and thank you, DPIIC members, for endorsing this effort, and thank you for your participation. Your participation in this effort is truly what makes this successful. So let's get into the Integrated Modeling Steering Committee, or what we're calling IMSC, update. I'd like to start by explaining the image that I have here in front of you. This is meant to show that we are using models in our decision-making, and they do provide a lot of good information. But as you can see on the left side here, we are receiving information from various independent sources, which makes it difficult to understand the interactions between them. This makes it difficult to use all of our good science for making complex decisions. Now over here on the right side, we have the same information being integrated and coordinated into one ecosystem model that evaluates the interactions between all the different models and provides the manager with better and more cohesive information that they can use for their decision-making. An integrated and collaborative modeling approach will help with coordination across agencies and disciplines, and it will help us gain an overall better understanding of the trade-offs between different management strategies, say flow objectives and ecosystem benefits, for example. The need for this has been highlighted in many reports and venues for a long time now, including here at the DPIIC. Integrated modeling is also emphasized in the Delta Science Plan and Science Action Agenda. I've included a quote here from the Delta Independent Science Board, where they wrote a letter to key agency directors and decision makers. Almost all modeling efforts are currently focused on urgent, project-specific management and regulatory needs, but this comes at the expense of broad system-level understanding and management of water flows and quality. A permanent, forward-looking, integrated modeling venue in the Delta will help address these concerns. Oops, excuse me. Okay, so with all that in mind, we created the IMSC. We are a group of modelers and managers from state and federal agencies, academia, NGOs, and private industry, with the mission to create a strategy for developing this ideal modeling community here in the Delta. I've included our mission statement and the long-term vision here, but I'd just like to summarize our goal as providing a detailed strategy for creating this integrated modeling community that will eventually lead to a permanent venue where everybody can work and have access to modeling that informs our complex decisions in the Delta. So let's get into the progress to date. We've been able to produce some important and foundational documents that we will use to create the plan for implementation. I'm showing here our 4 foundational memos and our synthesis papers. Our synthesis papers are written for both technical and non-technical audiences, and they include some key information and findings, such as our modeling inventory that highlights over 75 different models across many different disciplines. These are currently being used in the Delta, but having a better coordination between them is an important part of our strategy. We also did case studies of recent integrated modeling efforts, which included interviews with key staff that worked on them. This helped us create our challenges and potential solutions memo. Our work also highlights the need to unify and adopt some modeling best practices in order to overcome the lack of coordination between agencies and the different models that they use. We have created a modeling best practices memo that will serve as the foundation for that effort. This work will help build the modeling community that will protect our investments in science by retaining institutional knowledge and incorporating new technologies and scientific developments. So what's next? We're currently planning a workshop where we'll use these documents to create detailed alternative work plans for moving forward. These alternatives will include specific tasks and resource needs. When we have our set of alternatives ready, we plan to come back to DPIIC to present a deeper dive so we can make a decision together about how to move forward. So thank you for your time today and your continued support.
Thank you, Ben. So next we're going to hear from Rachel Klopfenstein. She's an environmental scientist at the Delta Science Program. And she's going to be giving us an update on the Delta Social Science Task Force. This is a group of leading social scientists convened by the Delta Science Program to discuss how we can best integrate social science into the Bay Delta natural science activities. This is a recommendation from multiple sources. And Rachel's going to talk about that now.
I'll wait for the slides to get up, but
Hello and good afternoon, committee members. As Louise mentioned, I'm Rachel Kloffenstein, an environmental scientist with the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta Science program. I appreciate your time, and I'm excited to give you an update on the Delta Social Science Task Force, a panel of social scientists convened by the Delta Science program to provide recommendations for how we can better support and integrate social sciences here in the Delta. And before I discuss a little bit more of the task force itself, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with what I mean by social science. Social science is the process of describing, explaining, and predicting human behavior and institutional structures in interaction with their environments. This was the definition provided by a similar NOAA effort that was initially convened back in 2003. So like the natural sciences, social sciences include a broad suite of disciplines and methods, including sociology, psychology, human geography, economics, and many more. So engaging with the breadth of these disciplines can help to bring understanding to the human dimensions of the complex water and environmental challenges and questions that we face here in the Delta, and in furthering the state's co-equal goals. This is especially important in light of climate change. So for example, how do we address increasing challenges or increasing risks from climate change? Or specifically, when should we invest in levee improvements? This may be a question that an economist assess. An anthropologist might seek to identify what are the aspects of trust and sense of place that are involved with ecosystem recovery and the associated conflict. And for some time, there's been a call for more social sciences and better addressing human dimensions across many complex and large-scale aquatic systems, like the Delta, as well as the Chesapeake Bay and Puget Sound. This need was mentioned during the 2016 Science Enterprise Workshop as well. And some systems have started to tackle this issue, like us here in the Delta. For example, in the Puget Sound, 2 of their 6 ecosystem recovery goals focus specifically on human well-being. But to date, as recognized by the Delta Independent Science Board's review of research on the Delta as an evolving place, an important component of the state's co-equal goals, there has been limited social science research that has been conducted and funded. The DPIIC Endorse Science Action Agenda, as well as the updated Delta Science Plan, both also recognize the importance of social sciences. And the formation of this Delta Social Science Task Force was actually specifically called out as an action in the science plan. So this task force effort is one effort that's helping us to better address and integrate social sciences here in the Delta. And I now want to focus on some of the expected products and outcomes of this effort. The independent task force, which is made up of social scientists from across the country, will provide recommendations for how to integrate more social sciences here in the Delta, focusing on things like funding, research, and building capacity. Agencies and entities in the Delta can then take these recommendations and the strategic approach to collectively build capacity for conducting social science, integrating social and natural sciences, and advancing the co-equal goals. We also hope that these recommendations can help to inform future funding proposals and solicitations and general increased funding for social sciences. With this effort, we want to build the diversity of science fields that are used to inform decision-making and strengthen the Delta Science enterprise. This timeline here highlights some of the key steps in our process so far, and the red star indicates where we're at. So in December, the task force will release their draft report with time for comment from agencies and entities that are interested. They will then incorporate comments and release a final report in March of 2020. So moving forward, I'll briefly highlight 2 opportunities for DPIIC agency engagement. First, commit staff time to participate in review of the draft report sometime in early 2020 to be facilitated by the Delta Science program to provide your agency's feedback for the task force to consider with the hope of strengthening the final recommendations. Second, consider which staff can help to implement the forthcoming recommendations from the task force in collaboration with the Delta Science program and the other agencies that are currently working to collectively address this need for more social science and for furthering the vision of one Delta, one science, or perhaps, I guess, now one estuary, one science. Lastly, we anticipate that the chair of the task force, Dr. Jim Sankarico, will present the final report at the March DPIIC meeting, which will be an opportunity to ask questions and engage more directly with one of the task force members. With that, I want to thank you all for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you, Rachel. So we're going to hear next from Karen Kafitz. She is an environmental program manager at the Delta Science Program, and she's going to tell us about the outcomes of a major effort to evaluate ecosystem effects of the 2015 emergency drought barrier on the False River. Delta Science Program coordinated and funded about $1 million of research on the barrier's ecological effects. And this effort is really an excellent example of science to support management and policy. Karen's going to provide us with an overview.
Thanks, Louise, for the introduction. So rather than a PowerPoint, I've provided for your binder a 2-page summary, and I'm just going to go over a few of the highlights from that summary page. So I'll talk about a little background of why the 2015 drought barrier was built and the interagency process that we went through to coordinate research on that project, and then I'll touch on a couple of the ecological outcomes, and I'm happy to answer questions about any of the others. So as you probably remember, from 2012 to 2015, the state was experiencing an extremely extreme drought. Reservoir supplies were limited, and there were concerns that upstream reservoirs did not have sufficient fresh water to keep salt water from entering the Central Delta and endangering the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. So in order to ameliorate that concern, the Department of Water Resources took an emergency action with authorization of the governor's office to build a drought barrier, which was a 750-foot rock wall in the Central Delta that cut off a key point of water access between the West Delta and the Central Delta. And detailed modeling done by the department showed that that action would keep salt water from entering and getting trapped in the Central Delta during those drought conditions. So on the one-pager, if you look at the figure on the right side of the first page, it just shows a schematic diagram kind of zoomed into that Central Delta area where you can see Frank's Tract, a major open water body, an old flooded tract in the Central Delta, and in the top frame you see what the concept was if there was no barrier installed, that salt water was going to enter from False River into Frank's Tract and through a tidal pumping mechanism would get trapped there and would be hard to wash out. And then in the second frame on the bottom, the barrier condition where a barrier was built across False River to block off that access, and instead of entering Frank's Tract, that salty water was pushed upstream into the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. This action allowed the department to maintain compliance with water quality standards and to protect water in upstream reservoirs. This was also a really interesting large-scale experiment, and the Delta Science Program, the Department of Water Resources, the USGS, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife all thought that this would be a really interesting opportunity scientifically and provide insights into some fundamental ways that these sorts of management actions could affect the ecology. So in order to address some of those interesting hypotheses, the Delta Science Program and the Department of Water Resources combined forces and got together a group of scientists to discuss what the potential ecological outcomes were, and several of those scientists came up with proposed work. And the Delta Science Program funded almost $1 million, as Louise said, of scientific research that was carried out by academic and agency scientists, a good portion by the USGS and labs at the San Francisco State University Estuary Ocean Science Center, and collaborators at UC Davis as well. And so we looked into a bunch of different things that the barrier might do, and some of those are summarized on the end of the first page, but I'm actually going to have you flip to the second page, and I'm going to discuss just one of the major outcomes that we found in terms of ecological effects. So first I'll say one of the really important outcomes of research on the barrier is that we found that the barrier did work as it was intended. It kept salt water out of that Central Delta, and it saved water in upstream reservoirs. In terms of ecological effects, there were many hypotheses, theories from scientists of potential negative effects of the barrier, that it might cut off food supply for delta smelt that were downstream, that the reduced mixing might cause a stagnant effect that would encourage the growth of harmful algal blooms, and it turns out that most of those harmful ecological effects were not found to be persistent. So there were some temporary effects that, once the barrier was removed, went back to their normal state. But I'll highlight that there was one persistent effect of the barrier, and I have a figure on the right side of the page that highlights that, and that is the persistent spread of aquatic weeds. So the figure on this right side of the page shows aerial maps of Frank's Tract, with light blue showing open water and dark blue showing vegetation from 2014, 15, 16, 17, and 18. So you see the year before the barrier in 2014, there's a large open water area in the center of the tract. That's because high velocity water enters through False River and rips up any vegetation that takes root in that area. However, in 2015, the next panel over, there was the barrier there during those summer months. That big fire hose of water was cut off, and aquatic vegetation took root in the areas that had been previously clear. In 2016, 2017, and 2018, it appears that that vegetation has persisted. So even though the barrier was removed at the end of 2015, that vegetation itself may have a slowing effect on the water, slowing down that fire hose jet, and meaning that that previously clear area no longer gets cleared. So it's a very important outcome for the folks that use Frank's Tract for boating, recreation, fishing, duck hunting. It's also an important outcome for native species. There's potential harm for native fish in having this area clogged with submerged aquatic vegetation, and it poses an extreme management concern. The state spends a lot of resources on trying to manage aquatic vegetation with chemicals and with mechanical removal. So one of the important take-home lessons from this is that we really need to work to anticipate and proactively manage our aquatic vegetation and mitigate for the increased spread of aquatic weeds when we're making these kinds of management actions. And these lessons are being discussed now in a new frame for Frank's Tract. There's ongoing conversation about how to manage aquatic weeds in Frank's Tract and how potential future modifications of Frank's Tract could reduce the aquatic weed problem. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. So our final, definitely not least speaker is Jeff Henderson. He is the Deputy Executive Officer for Planning at the Delta Stewardship Council. And he gives us an update on Delta Plan performance measures, which brings us full circle in our efforts to define and measure our progress for a more resilient landscape.
All right, thank you, Louise. I'll just take a few minutes, and there's a quick PowerPoint presentation to go with this. But a few minutes to share with you some Delta Plan performance measures that relate to the previous discussion today regarding the California Water Resilience Portfolio. And in your binders, you'll find a 4-page handout that highlights these measures. By way of background, as you may know, the Delta Plan guides decision-making in 3 ways: through regulatory policies that apply to certain plans, projects, and programs that are proposed by state and local agencies, through recommendations that guide the actions and decisions of state and local agencies in the Delta, many of which are represented here on the DPIIC, and through performance measures that demonstrate how well recommended actions are progressing and how well the Delta is responding to those actions, as well as external influences. Delta Plan performance measures really are a touch point that describe both how well our agencies are working together to implement the Delta Plan and how our collective actions make a physical difference. Performance measures generally translate the goals and objectives of the Delta Plan into measurable progress indicators. They enable us to evaluate how effective our management decisions are.
They also allow us to track trends that can inform adaptive management and decision-making. There are a total of 154 performance measures in the Delta Plan, and there are multiple types. There are 122 what we refer to as administrative performance measures that identify and track timely completion of agency actions or decisions. There are also 32 output and outcome performance measures that identify and track the results of those decisions using metrics, baseline values, and targets. More than a dozen Delta Plan performance measures address reduced reliance on the Delta, alternative water supplies, water conservation, water exports, and water quality topics that relate to the California Water Resilience Portfolio discussions and the discussion that occurred at our meeting here today. Among these, several reinforce the value of local and regional planning by tracking progress for urban and agricultural water management plans, SGMA groundwater sustainability plans, and strategic levy investments and emergency planning. Multiple performance measures also highlight the importance of maintaining functional flows that benefit the Delta ecosystem, a key consideration in the voluntary agreement process that's coming forward. The administrative performance measures relate mostly to the work of this committee, as they track the decisions and actions that each agency takes to implement the Delta Plan, and they help us chart progress. In preparation for today's discussion, Council staff reviewed the adopted administrative measures related to the scope of the ongoing discussions regarding the portfolio. There are 41 administrative measures that relate to the topics that I previously summarized. Of these, 18 have been completed in the past 5 years, and 23 remain in progress. This year, the Council also completed a performance measures dashboard, which is available online at viewperformance.deltacouncil.ca.gov. The dashboard includes all 154 performance measures and provides different layers of detail for various users. For example, there's top-line information available for decision makers. There are also details that are of value to researchers and technical staff. The metrics, the baseline values, and the targets for many of these measures were recently defined in 2018. So for many of these measures, we have very limited data points. Nevertheless, the dashboard includes visualizations that may begin to illustrate trends once we have multiple years' worth of data applied. We're anticipating that these trends will be of key interest to your agencies, and we'll plan to provide updates on an ongoing basis to inform decisions. Our staff assess progress on these administrative measures on an annual basis, and we will continue to reach out to subject matter experts at your agencies to complete our 2020 progress update. I'll quickly conclude by summarizing some key aspects of the measures related to the portfolio discussions that are ongoing and concluding. First, implementation of the Delta Plan is a key component of the water resilience portfolio, as demonstrated by the alignment of the performance measures with the portfolio discussion topics. And performance measures track implementation of the Delta Plan and progress toward measurable targets. And again, given their alignment, these performance measures can be used to help demonstrate the effectiveness of portfolio actions in the Delta. Again, building on some of the previous discussion regarding common data sources and pooled resources. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you to all of the speakers. I'd like to ask if we do have time for questions. We do? Okay. Okay, 5 minutes. Do any of members of the committee have time? Have questions?
Go ahead, Louise.
Well, I can ask one question. This is for Dr. Israel. I am hearing a theme in this meeting of we have adaptive management, real-time management, structured decision-making as a potential tool. And I'm wondering how you may see structured decision-making as, is there a role for it in the real-time management that we discussed earlier in the revised biological opinions?
That's a pretty good question. I think that a lot of structured decision-making where we are now is trying to have a better model. And so, it took us about 3 versions or about 5 years to get to a model where people felt comfortable in CVPIA, trying to develop some near-term restoration strategies that would set us on a course for, you know, an interannual cycle, a 5-year cycle of trying to determine the best way to reach the outcome of having more adults returning and greater numbers of fish exiting the delta from those tributaries. And so I think there's a lot of potential in structured decision-making to come up with how to stage actions in time and space better. And once that occurs, I think that it will help us with understanding how to implement those things in real time when water supply is available and when fish population is being seen in certain places and certain abundances and things like that.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
I do have a question also for Dr. Israel. You mentioned the technical team wanted to include flood risk reduction somehow, but didn't have the expertise at the table or the resources. Could you talk a little bit more about what it was that triggered wanting to integrate that into the model?
I might pass that over to Ben, but I think everyone understands that that's a really important issue in the Delta.
Mm-hmm.
And so they didn't want to not address it because we are trying to look at meaningful outcomes in scenarios and being able to see what happens due to those scenarios and the outcomes that occur due to them. But we just didn't really have the resources to go that direction in rapid prototyping. I think it's something that would be a really good thing to advance in the next phases.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that is part of the rapid prototyping process is that a lot of folks didn't have a whole lot of time to know what exactly it is that we were trying to accomplish. So that was a big part of the first phase, was having that conversation about what is it that we are trying to accomplish. And so folks brought up the fact that that we wanted to address that, and we actually identified some folks that would be really good on the technical side to address that, but unfortunately they were caught up in other projects at the time.
Yeah.
And so but hopefully we can grab those same folks and make them part of the next phase.
Great, thank you.
Susan?
Go
ahead. Go ahead, Michael.
After you, go ahead. Quick question about the social science task force. To what extent will that group actually contact, work with, and learn from honest-to-God people in the Delta? or is that part of the plan, and if so, how?
Unfortunately, for this effort, it's primarily focusing on the agencies that are conducting science, and so supporting social science research. That, in turn, should facilitate more opportunity to engage with communities if we're assessing human populations using more social science disciplines. But the current task force, no, is not focusing on contacting communities, working with agencies, but that's about it.
So, Ben, I've got a question for you about the integrated modeling process. You talked kind of aspirationally about getting all the modelers together in a place where they could share information, tools, and collaborate. Can you give us an update about kind of where that stands and time frame? Because I know that there's often frustration that we've got models that don't talk to each other, where the outcome from one set of models doesn't fully integrate with another model where we're trying to get answers.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Well, currently there are a lot of models that that are well integrated, and we use them, but there's still a lot of models out there. I was pointing to 75 different models in the inventory that we made. And there isn't a lot of coordination between amongst a lot of those, so that's what we're shooting for. But as far as that venue, we're still trying to work on exactly what that looks like. We've started some in the virtual space, and hopefully it's going to be at least that, and maybe in the future it will be some sort of physical facility or campuses around the Delta where folks can come together and on bigger ideas and kind of pass down that institutional knowledge and be able to better integrate the models that we have and create some new ones where we find the gaps. But the workshop is really going to take all this, all the work that we've done to date, and we're going to kind of take the expertise and the creativeness of all of the staff members that you've allowed us to partner with, and we're going to hopefully come up with really detailed specific tasks for a strategy of what that looks like and how to get there and what kind of resources are needed to do that. But there's a wide range of what do you want out of it, and how much resources is it going to take to do that. So we plan to come to you with kind of a range of specific detailed work plans and the necessary resources to achieve the desired outcomes.
Campbell.
Just a quick one for Karen. I'm wondering if Department of Boating and Waterways is anticipating hitting that section of Frank's Tract hard in the near term for their submerged aquatic vegetation control program to kind of reverse the process?
Yeah, so the Department of Boating and Waterways has a very limited amount that they can, like acreage amount that they can work on. And so their priorities tend to be in areas that are really where the people are parking their boats, where they're using their boats most. So the Bethel Island community, which is on the southern edge, is a target area where there's quite a bit of management action from the Department of Boating and Waterways. One of the problems with aquatic vegetation is it's a plant, and plants make seeds, and those seeds move in water and go other places. And so the more vegetation you have near an area that is being treated, the more propagules, the more seeds you have to come back into that area and spread the plant again. And so I think I can't speak on behalf of Department of Boating and Waterways and what their priorities are, but it's a very large area to manage, and I don't think it would be within their scope to use chemical treatment to take out everything that's in Frank's Tract. So we have to be thinking about other kinds of solutions than just treatment.
Great.
Can I add just a little bit to that discussion? This is a really great question. And Boating and Waterways actually has a recent result where they've done a great job of looking at their own data of treating Frank's Tract over about 10 years, and noted that after successive years of treatment, they found that they started seeing a different species of aquatic vegetation rather than the first one that they started treating. So you can think about this aquatic vegetation problem as a bit of a Hydra monster. I like to think about it, if you cut off one head, another will appear. So this is an area where we are in desperate need of adaptive management. And in opening our minds in terms of the potential tools and allowing our agencies, the state parks, to try those tools is a really important effort for the Delta.
Mm-hmm. And it certainly seems like it could be a point of assistance for DPIIC as well, to help highlight the need for ecological priorities and even hydrodynamic priorities in the Delta relative to invasive species, and not the somewhat limited focus just on recreational constraints. But
yeah, great question.
Susan, if I could just add to
sure,
that,
Karen.
both Fish and Wildlife and CDFA have some limited funds for the biodiversity initiative, and there's not nearly enough money for all of this, but we have not had weed management for quite some time. We actually do some contract work for boating and waterways. So if this were prioritized and we could define some approaches to try to get ahead of these aquatic weeds, which would be very challenging, we might want to think about that as part of the biodiversity initiative going forward.
Okay.
Some strategic planning around that.
That's great news. Well, we are at 3:30. Thank you very much to the panelists for the lightning updates and evidence of DPIIC endorsed actions that are making progress and improving science and modeling and on-the-ground efforts. And thank you also to all the DPIIC members for participating, and thank you to Kyle and Aubrey, if you're still on the webcast with us. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. I'll make one quick announcement. Our draft Delta Plan ecosystem amendment is expected out in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and we welcome DPIIC agency and anyone who wishes to comment. We welcome your comments on that draft plan. We're finalizing our DPIIC meeting schedules for 2020, and it sounds like right off the bat we'll have some pretty heavy items to talk about, and I think I'm going to pursue Karen's suggestion about prioritizing the aquatic weed management, the Hydra monster. So thank you everyone for participating today, and we'll see you at the next DPIIC meeting. Meeting adjourned.
About how it's being sprayed and if it's being sprayed within the tolerances. But I would urge people to be aware of the limitations on chemical control. And one other subject, there's a talk about voluntary agreements. It's 25 years since the Bay Delta Accord was signed. It was December 1994, and it was signed by Cal EPA, California Natural Resources, U.S. Interior, U.S. Commerce, and U.S. EPA. They were the parent agencies of everybody here. So we have been under a voluntary agreement for the last 25 years, and I just urge you, as we look at going into a new set of voluntary agreements, to look at what hasn't worked for the past 25 years, because we have been operating under one, and it was part of the CalFed framework and the CalFed ROD that was adopted in 2000. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Deirdre. Thank you for taking the time to comment. And with that, meeting adjourned.